Hi everyone, I'm Eve and welcome back to my channel as well as another discussion for the book History of Yoga All Started on a Stone by Ramis Kachar. This week we will be talking about chapter 4. If you haven't already seen the videos for the introduction, chapter 1, and then chapters 2 and 3, I'll be sure to link them somewhere up here so that way you can go check those out. And with that, we'll get right into chapter 4. All right. Chapter 4 is titled Where It All Began, and this covers the pre-classical era, which started in 500 BCE and goes until about 200 BCE. Again, these are about estimates for these time frames and covers the post-Vedic era and the different changes to religious and spiritual philosophy that affects yoga's history. In particular, this chapter talks about the Upanishads, and the Upanishads are a series of texts that focus a lot on the foundation of yogic philosophy that we know today. And just like the Vedas, they were a collection of knowledge. The difference between the Upanishads and the Vedas, well, the main difference between them seems to be that the Upanishads focus much more on an internal or a spiritual practice rather than the connection with the external or trying to influence the external world. And what's more is this is where the ideas of karma and dharma really begin to take hold in the world and become their own idea and concept. And I have to check my notes really quick. Oh, yes. And the big thing is the idea of enlightenment has really come into full force, and that is something that people are working towards reaching. It is estimated that there are about 200 of these different types of texts, and giving different strategies to work towards enlightenment, in particular, the concept of mindfulness or meditation, being able to control the mind, has become very important. And within one of these texts, they describe yoga or yoking to give a metaphor between an animal being connected to a chariot. So the mind and the body working together and being connected, while another one of these texts talks about the idea of prana and the breath. So, prana being our life energy or our life force. And if you have the book, I strongly encourage you to read the really fascinating story about prana, and I guess you could call it the mythology behind how it came into fruition. Going back to the breath, I find the breath is extremely important because in my own practice and what I've seen in different participants who come to class is the way that we breathe changes how we're feeling, or perhaps our mood or our level of energy. For instance, sometimes I go in to teach a class and I'm feeling very anxious and just, I guess, buzzing around. And by the end of class, I've taken the time to breathe deeply and relax and bring my mind and my body back together so that way I can be present for the people who are also in class. And I feel much calmer at the end of class. And this is kind of the concept behind the breath, of being able to help us control or navigate our prana by being able to elevate our mood, calm our mood down. Perhaps it's moving through those different rough situations. And I really think of prana as being our mood and our energy. At this point in time, yoga is a practice that is used to work towards enlightenment, and there are various methods that are used to reach this goal. In particular, going back to prana, there is the practice of controlling the breath, which is known as pranayama. Another method that was developed during this time period is pratyahara, which is very similar to the abstaining, so abstaining from the world. However, in this concept, there's the idea of abstaining or removing one from their own senses to allow them to focus on the internal world, and then practicing drawing the internal and the external world together. Ramis does make a note that Buddhism is developing at this time as well with similar practices. However, in Buddhism, there is more of the focus on how our internal self or internal world, in Ramis's words, affect our external experiences or our external worlds. The final portion of this chapter focuses on two different texts, the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad-Gita. Both of these texts do talk a little bit about war, and the Mahabharata focuses on talking about the devastation that occurs with war, and from these different stories come different philosophical concepts, and I'm going to read straight from Ramis's words here. The idea of nonviolence, happiness in life, the reversal of karma and vegetarianism, and all of these different aspects are to help people work towards the goal of reaching liberation and enlightenment. In these texts, we also begin to see a shift from the abstaining into being more present in the world and how our actions affect not only ourselves, the people around us, as well as our environment. And again, directly quoting Ramis here, by this point, yoga was starting to develop from a practice that removes oneself from the world to a practice that requires you to be fully engaged. Only when someone is fully engaged in the world could they enact positive change to it. Again, to use Ramis's words because they do an excellent job of summing up the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is a story of a man, Arjuna, and his discussion about war and death with God Krishna. The Bhagavad Gita is a story that demonstrates the connection between self and the universe. It emphasizes that yoga helps to achieve this connection. Ramis states that the Bhagavad Gita is the first thorough discussion of various yoga practices, and within the text, it describes 18 different ways to connect with the Supreme Being. So that's the idea of perhaps it's the universe, perhaps it's God, perhaps it's a different concept that is similar to those previously stated ones, and being able to connect with those through yoga. If you're looking to learn more about the Bhagavad Gita, know that there is the ability to read it today. It does come in various translations. I have not personally read the Bhagavad Gita. However, I have read a book several years ago now, and if I remember the name correctly, it's called The Secrets of the Bhagavad Gita, and it is working to explain these different concepts that are found within the book and explain a little bit more into how they manifest. Ramis also does make note that a lot of these concepts that are brought up in the Bhagavad Gita have actually influenced Western culture to this day. So if you have the book, I strongly encourage you to read in this section to find out more about that. And with that, that wraps up the end of the pre-classical era, setting us up for our next chapter, chapter 5, which is called It's a Classic. And of course, it is going to cover the classical era from 200 BCE all the way up to 500 CE. So we'll see you next week for that, and stay tuned for a few questions. I have a 2-in-1 question to start with. The first part being, have you practiced breathwork or pranayama before? And if you have, what was your experience like? For me, I've done quite a few different breath practices, and I would say that I probably have 3 that I've really stuck to and remember. And 2 of them I teach in class. So one is just breath awareness, paying attention to how you're breathing and what your body is feeling like. and then working on deep belly breathing, which is the practice of drawing the breath down into the bottom of the lungs, feeling the stomach expand, and then exhaling as normal as opposed to breathing up into your chest. I find that this really helps me to focus on my breathing and slow my breath work down. The final one that I have done and do on and off to this day is the Wim Hof method, which is it's kind of a cyclical hyperventilation. And I'm not a teacher for it, so I strongly encourage you to look it up in case you're interested in learning more about that. Again, that's the Wim Hof method. My next question for you is, have you tried any mindfulness practices or any meditative practices? And again, what was your experience with those? My answer for this one is very similar to my last answer. Is yes, I've practiced different meditations or different mindfulness practices, and the big one that I use to this day is just practicing being aware of the breath and paying attention to it. I've also done, the other week actually, I did a taste meditation or a mindfulness practice with, sorry, there's a motorcycle outside, different tastes. So we were tasting strawberries, practicing noticing all the different flavors, as well as chocolate, and paying attention to the texture, the smell, thinking about how that piece of food made it all the way to our hands, into our mouths, and then all of the different things that it can do for our body. So, breaking the different nutrients down and providing our bodies energy. And I found this taste meditation extremely important at this time in my life since I'm in a very busy go, go, go stage. And it was like the first time in 2 or 3 weeks that I had really sat down and paid attention to what I was eating. And I was very thankful to have been offered that moment and taken that moment for myself to sit back, slow down, and reflect, even on something that seems so routine as eating. It's okay to slow down, take the time, and pay attention to those things because, again, going back to the idea that food is what gives us energy, and being able to think about that and being thankful to say, okay, this is providing me energy, it's providing me nutrition, and then to go on and say, this practice is also providing me support for my mental health to take a break and care for my body as well as my mind. Last but not least, did you know that yoga started as a meditative practice rather than a physical one? And if you didn't know the answer, were you surprised by this? Prior to reading this book, I did know that yoga started as a meditative practice. So I wasn't surprised when this idea was brought up in the book. And there's a few different reasons as to why. One, I grew up with various Buddhist practices as well as yoga in my household. And then in college, I took a world religion class, and they briefly touched on yoga and Hinduism and how yoga had started as a meditative practice. And of course, in my yoga teacher training, I don't know, or I can't remember if it was said explicitly that it started as this type of practice. However, I know that yoga history was certainly brought up and touching on some of these various texts, more focused on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And maybe we'll get into that if Ramis mentions those ideas later on in the book. Anyway, thank you so much for watching and joining me for this week's discussion. Next week, again, we'll be covering chapter 5, and I hope you stay tuned, and we'll see you next week and hopefully in the discussion as well. Bye!